Hello everybody, this is Mr. Jackson, and today we're going to be going over Unit 2, Lesson 3, Part 1, where we're going to start exploring the macromolecules. So let's get right into it. So whenever I say macromolecules, what I'm referring to are these large organic molecules that make up all living things. So macro is always referring to large, and obviously molecules are these materials that contain more than one type of atom or element, right? So they're very large organic. Again, that means carbon containing, very large molecules that make up all living things. And in this lesson, we're going to end up covering the four major macromolecules, which are carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, and nucleic acids. Important thing to remember, we can't live without these. These are highly, highly important for our survival, for our function as human beings. They run our body. They hold information for how to run our body. They provide the energy to run our bodies. These are absolutely essential. And even more than their actual function in our body, we also have to keep in mind everything that we will learn for the rest of the year, the rest of the semester, it's going to relate back to these macromolecules. Everything that we're about to cover moving forward will in some way refer back to these fundamental building blocks in our bodies. Now, structurally, most of these macromolecules are polymers made of monomers. So let me go through real quick what I mean by that. Now, whenever I talk about a monomer, mono usually meaning one, a monomer is a small basic subunit, right? It's an individual subunit of something that's much larger. You could think of it as a single brick in a brick wall. You could think of it as a single word in a sentence. This is some individual building block that will come together with other monomers to build what we call polymers. Polymers are larger, more complex structures made of these monomers, right? So an example, if you use the monomer as a single brick and you put a bunch of those together, you create the polymer, which is a brick wall. If you take a bunch of monomers, which are like individual words, and put them together, it would make the polymer, which is kind of like a full sentence. Okay, so monomers combine to form polymers. And whenever that happens, if you see down here to the bottom left, you can see that that process is actually called polymerization. So that is the process of creating polymers from individual building blocks like monomers. So let's get into the first of our macromolecules. We're actually going to cover two in this first part of the lesson. So the first one is carbohydrates. Carbohydrates, their main function is short-term energy storage. Short-term because this is a very readily accessible supply of energy in living organisms. They also give us structure. They support transport. They support cell signaling. There's a lot of things that these carbohydrates could do in our bodies. These are typically found in sugars and starches, a lot of the foods we eat, like our grains, fruits, and vegetables. And big thing to remember is that carbohydrates, they're typically made up of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen in a 1-to-1 ratio, meaning they're typically found with 1 carbon, 2 hydrogen, and 1 oxygen in some combination. Okay, so those are the important fundamentals of what carbohydrates are. We want to break this down a little bit further, right? Because again, we're talking about monomers and polymers and why they're relevant to us. Importantly, monomers are referred to as monosaccharides in carbohydrates, right? So these refer to little single sugar molecules. And I gave you some examples here. You do not have to remember these examples. Just know that the monosaccharides are the smallest building blocks for carbohydrates. And when you take a bunch of these single saccharides and put them together, you get the polymer, and we call it poly or mini saccharides, polysaccharides. These are very large sugar molecules. And again, I gave you some examples of those, polysaccharides, such as starch, glycogen, cellulose, and where you would find these in nature. And also, finally, in terms of energy storage, remember, these are a really good supply of energy, easily accessible energy in the body. And carbohydrates typically will provide 4 calories per gram whenever we use them for energy. So this means that the body can access and break it down very easily. So it's typically the first thing that our bodies are going to break down to get energy when we need it. We have circulating blood sugar, like blood glucose. That's a ready supply of energy. We have stored form, like muscle glycogen. So if we run low, we can actually break down those bigger sugars into smaller usable ones. The second macromolecule, and the last one we're going to talk about in the first part of this lesson, are our lipids, more commonly referred to as fats, but their official term is lipids. Their main function is long-term energy storage. Long-term energy storage. So for activity that lasts a very long time or at lower levels of exertion, these are a really good energy source that help do that. Other uses for lipids or fats in the body, giving our bodies insulation, like in body fat, protecting our major organs, and structure. They help provide structure to cells and tissues. We typically find these in fats, oils, and phospholipids. We're actually going to go into that here in just a moment, where we find those in cell membranes, or those boundaries that create our cells. And they're also found in steroids. These lipids, these fats, are made mostly from carbon and hydrogen. Okay, and then we can see some common sources in the picture below of fats in our diet. So like from seeds, nuts, fish, and avocados, and also the oils like olive oil. The single small functional units of lipids are fatty acids. That's the monomer. And you can actually see what fatty acids look like if you look at the image over here to the right. So if I were to look at, a little container of olive oil, and I were to look at each of those little lipids within that olive oil, this is actually what those look like, the chemical formula for those fatty acids. If you take all those fatty acids and you bind them together, many of them together, you form the polymer called triglycerides. And importantly, energy storage, you can actually get a lot more energy per gram in fats compared to in carbohydrates. Carbohydrates had 4 calories per gram, whereas lipids, when you break these down, they actually give you 9, so more than double the energy when you break these down. And so when your body runs out of those easy to access carbs, or your physical activity lasts longer durations of time and you need more fuel or energy to continue working, then it's going to break down lipids as a secondary source for that more long-term energy. And once we get into those fats, again, you're getting a lot more energy per gram from fats as compared to carbohydrates. So we do have one special lipid that I want to make sure that we talk about before moving forward into part 2, because we're actually going to see these a lot as we move into cell structure and cell function. And so let's break down. There's one type of lipid called a phospholipid, and that's what you're seeing down below in the image. I want you to specifically focus on the left simpler image, because we don't really have to go into the specifics of the chemical structure like on the right. It's just there for your reference. But the typical structure of a phospholipid is you're going to have 2 fatty acids and 1 phosphate. Okay, so typically you're going to say that you have a hydrophilic head. That's that phosphate group. So the phosphate is actually found here in blue. It's that blue hydrophilic head or circle at the top. And then that's attached to a hydrophobic set of tails. Okay, so you have these fatty acid tails connected to a phosphate head. And it's important also to know these 2 key terms. So we've got hydrophilic, hydro meaning water, philic coming from philia, which is loving. Okay, so hydrophilic is water loving. And then we've got hydrophobic, hydro meaning water, phobic referring to a phobia or a fear of or hate for. And so the water hating tails are attached to the water loving heads. And that's going to become very important here in just a moment. And to finish up our conversation, this is why we wanted to know about the water loving and the water hating aspects of the phospholipids, is because these are a really, really important type of lipid because they literally create our cell membranes, those outside boundaries that allow certain things in and allow certain things to leave the cell as needed. The fact that we have this boundary that only lets certain things in or out makes that boundary or that membrane selectively permeable, right? So not everything can just flow freely into and out of the cell, and it helps regulate cell function because we only have what we need, and we only bring in the things we need. We only release the things that we don't need from the cell. And this actually, so these phospholipids create what's called a bilayer, where you have sort of like a sandwich, where you have the water-loving phosphate heads. They're still in blue. Those are kind of like the bread of a sandwich. And on the inside, away from the water that's surrounding the cell, you have these phospholipid, water-hating fatty acid tails. Okay, and you can kind of see what it might look like in a single sheet, as well as in the cell in total. Okay, so that is a quick introduction to macromolecules. It's breaking down what macromolecules are, and our first two, which were carbohydrates and lipids. A little over my 10-minute time here, so I'm going to go ahead and call it quits there. I hope this conversation was helpful, and we'll see you at the next one.